You need to hear this story, not because it's written in history books, though it is, but because it reveals something about the human spirit that no amount of modern weaponry can replicate. This is about a war where farmers became warriors, where kitchen knives were melted into arrowheads, and where a plant that grew in every backyard became the most feared weapon in Southeast Asia. November 10th, 1945, Surabaya. The British Empire, fresh from defeating Nazi Germany, arrived with tanks, artillery, and the confidence of a superpower. They expected compliance. What they got instead was a city that refused to die, defended by people who had nothing but sharpened bamboo and a word that had just entered their vocabulary: merdeka, freedom. But this story doesn't start with the battle. It starts 3 months earlier, in a village you've never heard of, with a man whose name won't appear in most textbooks, but whose actions would inspire thousands. His name was Darman, and on the morning of August 17, 1945, when Sukarno declared Indonesia's independence over a crackling radio, Darman was doing what he'd done every day for 32 years, tapping rubber trees in the plantation outside Malang, East Java. He didn't know that by November, he would kill 3 soldiers with his bare hands and a weapon he carved himself. He didn't know that his daughter would watch him die. And he didn't know that the British commander who faced him would later write in his classified report that the most terrifying moment of his military career wasn't Normandy or Burma. It was staring into the eyes of Indonesian villagers charging with bamboo spears, utterly unafraid of death. Let me tell you how a gardener's tool became a revolution. Darman was not a revolutionary. He was a father, a husband, a man whose hands were permanently stained with latex and whose back ached from years bent over rubber trees. The Dutch had owned the plantation where he worked since before he was born. They owned the land, the trees, the processing facility, and, though they never said it directly, they owned him too. Payment came in rations of rice and the privilege of a tin-roofed shack at the plantation's edge. His wife, Sumira, cleaned the Dutch overseer's house. His daughter, Dewi, 14 years old with her mother's sharp eyes, helped in the kitchen. On August 17th, the radio in the overseer's house broadcast Sukarno's declaration. Dewi heard it while washing dishes. She didn't understand all the words. The speech was in formal Indonesian, not the Javanese she spoke at home, but she understood the electricity in Sukarno's voice, the way the other workers stopped moving, the way her hands froze in the dishwater. Kami, bangsa Indonesia, dengan ini menyatakan kemerdekaan Indonesia. We, the people of Indonesia, hereby declare the independence of Indonesia. The Dutch overseer, Van der Berg, switched off the radio. "Back to work," he said in broken Malay. "Nothing changes here." But everything had already changed. When Dewi returned home that evening, she found her father sitting on their front step, which he never did. He was always working until dark. He was staring at his hands, turning them over slowly, as if seeing them for the first time. "Bapa," she said softly. "Father." "Dewi," he said without looking up, "do you know what I was thinking today while I cut the trees? I was thinking about how I've never owned anything. Not the tools I use, not the rubber I collect, not even the roof over our heads." He finally looked at her, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Not quite anger, not quite hope, something harder and brighter. "But the radio said we're free now, so I'm trying to understand what that means." Over the next 3 weeks, the plantation learned what it meant. The Dutch overseer, Van der Berg, fled to Surabaya with his family when a group of workers appeared at his door with machetes. Not to harm him, they simply stood there, silent, until he packed his belongings and left. The Indonesian plantation manager, a man named Sutomo, who'd always enforced Dutch rules with apologetic efficiency, called a meeting under the large banyan tree where workers gathered for announcements. "We need to organize. The Japanese are surrendering. The Dutch will try to return. The British are coming to manage the transition. We need to decide, do we defend this land or do we give it back to the people who claim to own it?" It was Darman who stood up. The other workers turned in surprise. Darman never spoke at meetings. "Forgive me, Pak Sutomo," he said, using the respectful address. "But what is there to decide? They're coming to take back what they stole. We say no, that's all. And if they bring weapons? Then we find weapons. We have machetes and farming tools. They have rifles and—" "Then we die free," Darman interrupted. The crowd went silent. "I'm not a smart man. I don't understand politics, but I understand this. I've lived 32 years as property. My daughter will not live one more day that way. If we have to fight with our hands, we fight with our hands. If we have to fight with stones, we fight with stones, but we don't give back what we just claimed." A younger worker named Hadi, barely 18, raised his hand. "My grandfather fought the Dutch in the Java War. He said they used bamboo spears, sharpened bamboo hardened in fire. They called them bambu runcing. He said they could pierce a man's chest." Sutomo nodded slowly. "I've heard the stories, but those were different times. These will be trained soldiers with—" "Let them have their training," Darman said. "We'll have our land. Pakati, can you show us how to make these spears?" That evening, in the clearing beside the rubber trees, Darman and 20 others learned the ancient craft. You select bamboo that's mature but not old, 3 to 4 years in the ground. You cut it at an angle to create a point. You scrape away the outer layer to expose the harder inner fibers. Then you hold it over fire, rotating it slowly, watching the tip darken and harden into something that can punch through leather, fabric, flesh, and if angled correctly, even thin metal. Dewi watched her father work, the firelight dancing across his concentrated face. He'd made hundreds of cuts in his life. Tapping rubber trees required precise, shallow incisions, but this was different. This cut had intention behind it. This cut had the weight of generations. "Baba," she whispered, "are you afraid?" He continued rotating the bamboo over the flames. "Every moment of every day since you were born, but I'm afraid of different things now. I used to be afraid of making the overseer angry, afraid of not meeting quota, afraid of losing this job and starving. Now I'm only afraid of one thing, that you'll grow up thinking the way we lived was normal, that you'll forget we were human beings before we were workers." She moved closer. "The Dutch woman I work for, Mevrouw Vanderberg, before they left, she told me something. She said the British are coming with thousands of soldiers. She said we should cooperate, that there will be a proper transition, that violent resistance will only make things worse." "She's probably right," Darman said. He pulled the bamboo from the fire and examined the hardened tip. It gleamed like polished horn. "But I don't care." On September 29th, the British arrived in Surabaya. Their mission, they announced, was straightforward: disarm the Japanese soldiers still in the city, maintain order during the transition period, and facilitate the return of Dutch colonial authority. They expected compliance. Surabaya, after all, was just another port city in just another colonial territory. They'd managed dozens of these transitions across Asia. They didn't understand that Surabaya wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. It was where Indonesian nationalism had deep roots, where trade unions and anti-colonial movements had flourished for decades, where people had tasted the possibility of self-governance during the Japanese occupation and had no intention of returning to Dutch rule. The resistance organized quickly. Former Indonesian soldiers who'd served under the Japanese, youth groups called Pemuda who were young and fearless and hungry for action, factory workers, dock workers, students, and people like Darman, plantation workers who'd never held a political thought in their lives but understood in their bones that something fundamental had shifted. The British commander, Brigadier Malaby, was a decorated officer who'd fought in North Africa and Burma. He was not a cruel man. He believed in following orders, maintaining discipline, and bringing order to chaos. When he received reports of armed resistance, he assumed it was isolated hotshots who could be contained. He issued a warning: surrender all weapons, return to your homes, and there will be no consequences. The Indonesians issued their own response: Merdeka atau mati, freedom or death. On October 25th, Malabi's forces began weapons confiscation operations. They moved through neighborhoods with trucks and armored cars, demanding that civilians surrender any weapons. They found caches of Japanese rifles, Dutch colonial-era pistols, even some modern weapons smuggled in from sympathetic nations. But they also found something they hadn't expected: thousands upon thousands of bamboo spears. "What the hell are these people thinking?" Malabi said to his aide, staring at an intelligence report. "They're facing trained soldiers with tanks and artillery, and they're making pointed sticks?" "Sir, the intelligence suggests it's symbolic, a show of defiance. They don't actually intend to use them in combat." Malabi looked out the window of his headquarters at Surabaya's crowded streets. "I hope you're right, because if they do, this will get bloody." He had no idea how right he was. By early November, tensions had reached a breaking point. Small skirmishes had erupted across the city. The British had underestimated the organization and determination of the resistance. Malabi negotiated a ceasefire, but both sides knew it was fragile. Darman arrived in Surabaya on November 8th with a group of 60 plantation workers. They'd walked for 2 days, carrying their bamboo spears and whatever food they could pack. Dewi had begged to come, but Darman had forbidden it. "Stay with your mother," he'd said. "If we don't return, take care of her." But Dewi had followed anyway, staying a half-day behind the group, sleeping in ditches and eating fruit stolen from roadside trees. She was 14 years old and terrified and absolutely certain that her father was walking toward his death. She needed to see it. She needed to understand what Merdeka cost. The plantation workers were directed to a neighborhood called Gubeng, where Indonesian forces had established a defensive position. The area was dense with narrow streets and residential compounds, difficult terrain for British vehicles. Darman's group was assigned to defend an intersection where 4 alleys converged. A local youth leader named Kusno, maybe 22 years old with a red and white bandana tied around his head, the colors of the new Indonesian flag, gave them quick instructions. "You hold this intersection. If they break through, they reach the hospital behind us. We have wounded there. Understand?" "We understand," Darman said. Kusno looked at the bamboo spears with barely concealed skepticism. "You know how to use those?" "We know how to work. The weapon doesn't matter. The will matters." November 10th dawned humid and tense. The ceasefire had collapsed the night before when a British convoy was attacked. Malabi himself had died in the fighting. Accounts vary on exactly how, but the result was clear. The British forces, shocked and enraged by the death of their commander, received new orders. The gloves were off. Surabaya would be pacified by force if necessary. The bombardment began at dawn. Naval guns from British ships in the harbor fired into the city. Artillery shells screamed overhead and exploded in residential neighborhoods. The British forces, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, began a systematic advance into Indonesian-held areas. Darman crouched behind an overturned cart at the intersection, his bamboo spear gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Around him, the other plantation workers waited. Some prayed quietly. Some checked and rechecked their spears. One man vomited from fear, and no one commented. "Here they come," someone whispered. The British advance was methodical and professional. An armored car rolled into the intersection first, its machine gun traversing left and right. Behind it came soldiers in formation, rifles ready, moving with the confidence of men who'd fought across 2 continents. The Indonesian commander gave no order to fire. They had only a handful of rifles anyway. The strategy was different. Let them advance. Let them think this would be easy. And when they were committed, when the vehicles couldn't easily reverse in the narrow streets, then surge forward with numbers and ferocity and the kind of desperate courage that professional soldiers never quite expected. The armored car rolled past Darman's position. 10 soldiers followed, 20, 30. Then the whistle split the air. What happened next would be described in British military reports as fanatical resistance and suicidal charges. What those reports didn't capture was the calculation behind the chaos. The Indonesian fighters knew they couldn't win a conventional engagement, but they could make every meter of territory cost more than it was worth. They could make the British soldiers understand that occupying Surabaya would mean fighting for every street, every alley, every building. Darman ran. He didn't think about it. When the whistle blew, his body moved. 32 years of plantation labor had built a wiry, enduring strength. He covered the 20 meters to the British formation faster than seemed possible for a middle-aged man. A soldier turned, bringing his rifle around. Darman thrust upward with the bamboo spear, aiming for the gap between the man's chest armor and his helmet. The hardened bamboo tip punched through the soldier's neck. Hot blood sprayed across Darman's face. The soldier fell. Darman had killed a man. The thought registered somewhere in his mind, distant and strange. He pulled the spear free and kept moving. The intersection became a melee. Bamboo spears flashed in the morning light, rifle shots cracked, men screamed. The armored car's machine gun opened fire, cutting down Indonesian fighters, but others surged forward to replace them. A homemade bomb, gasoline in a bottle with a rag fuse, arched through the air and exploded against the vehicle's side, sending flames curling across its armor. A British soldier, no more than 20 years old, with ginger hair and freckles, found himself separated from his unit and surrounded. He fired his rifle until it clicked empty, then swung it like a club. 3 Indonesian fighters fell before someone drove a bamboo spear through his thigh. He collapsed, screaming. Darman appeared above him, spear raised. The soldier stared up, his face contorted in pain and terror. He was someone's son. He probably had a sweetheart back in Manchester or London. He'd been following orders. Darman thought of Van der Berg, the Dutch overseer who'd never personally harmed him, but who'd represented every day of humiliation and powerlessness. He thought of Sukarno's voice on the radio. He thought of Dewi's future. He drove the spear through the soldier's chest.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The British forces pulled back, dragging their wounded. The intersection was held. Bodies lay sprawled in the morning heat. British, Indonesian, the distinction hardly mattered to the dead. Darman sat with his back against a wall, his spear across his lap, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Kusno, the young commander, appeared with water. "Drink." Darman drank. The water tasted like blood. Everything tasted like blood. "You did well," Kusno said. "They'll come again, probably with tanks this time. Can you hold?" "We'll hold." But Darman knew the truth. They might hold this intersection today. They might even hold it tomorrow. But the British had ships and planes and unlimited ammunition. Eventually, the mathematics of war would overwhelm courage. Eventually, they would be pushed back, surrounded, killed, or captured. It didn't matter. That's what the British would never understand. Winning this battle wasn't the point. Making them bleed for every meter was the point. Making the cost so high that they'd eventually leave was the point. Showing the world that Indonesians would rather die than return to colonial rule was the point. The bombardment resumed in the afternoon. Artillery shells walked closer to the intersection, the explosions growing louder and more accurate. A building collapsed in a cloud of timber and dust, then another. "Fall back," Kusno shouted. "Regroup at the hospital." The Indonesian fighters retreated in a controlled chaos, carrying wounded, dragging bodies of fallen comrades. Darman helped carry a young fighter who'd taken shrapnel in the stomach, the boy's blood soaking through his shirt. They never made it to the hospital. A British patrol, flanking through parallel streets, cut off their retreat. The Indonesians found themselves trapped in a residential compound, high walls, a single entrance, no escape route. "We're dead," someone said flatly. "Not yet," Kusno replied. He turned to Darman. You're a father, yes? I saw you looking at a photo earlier. Darman nodded. Then you're going to live through this. When they breach, you surrender. Tell them you were forced to fight. Tell them anything, but you live and you tell your daughter that we held this city as long as we could. I won't. That's an order. Someone needs to remember. The British assault on the compound was brief and efficient. They used grenades to clear the entrance, then poured in with overwhelming force. The Indonesian fighters, down to maybe 30 men with a handful of rifles and bamboo spears, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Darman found himself face to face with a British officer, a tall Sikh man with a magnificent beard and cold, professional eyes. The officer's rifle was aimed at Darman's chest. "Drop the spear." Darman didn't drop it. He couldn't. If he dropped it, everything it represented, the plantation, the declaration, the blood on the intersection, the future he wanted for Dewi, all of it would be meaningless. The officer's finger tightened on the trigger. A small figure crashed into Darman from the side, knocking him out of the line of fire. The rifle cracked. The bullet took the figure in the shoulder, spinning them around. Dewi. "No!" Darman screamed. His daughter collapsed, blood blooming across her shirt. She'd followed him to Surabaya. She'd followed him through the streets. She'd watched the battle from a rooftop, and when she saw him about to die, she'd done the only thing she could. Darman dropped the spear and fell to his knees beside her. "Dewi! Dewi, look at me!" Her eyes focused on his face. She was 14 years old, and she'd just taken a bullet for her father, and somehow she was smiling. "Papa, did we do it? Are we free?" Yes, we're free." Around them, the fighting had stopped. The British soldiers stared at the man holding his dying daughter. The Sikh officer lowered his rifle slowly. "Get the medic, now." But they all knew she was dying. The bullet had clipped her lung. Blood frothed at her lips. Her breathing came in wet, rattling gasps. "I'm sorry," Darman said, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I should have made you stay home. I should have—" "No," Dewi interrupted. Her voice was fading. "I wanted to see. I wanted to understand. Papa, I understand now. Why you couldn't just go back. Why the spear mattered." Her hand found his, squeezed weakly, and went still. Darman sat in the British detention facility for 3 weeks before they released him. They questioned him repeatedly. Who were the leaders? Where were the weapons caches? How was the resistance organized? But he gave them nothing. Not because he was protecting anyone. He genuinely didn't know most of the answers. He'd just been a plantation worker who picked up a bamboo spear and walked into history. When they finally let him go, Surabaya was still burning. The battle would continue for another week, becoming one of the bloodiest urban combats in Indonesian history. The British would eventually secure the city, but at such a cost that the international community would begin questioning whether colonialism was worth this price. The Dutch would attempt to return, but the resistance would continue, and within 4 years, Indonesia would achieve full independence. But Darman didn't see any of that. He walked out of the detention facility, collected his daughter's body from the British medical station, and began the long walk back to the plantation. He carried her wrapped in a white cloth, and he didn't stop walking until he reached home. Sumira was waiting. She saw him coming from a distance and knew immediately. A mother always knows. She didn't scream or collapse. She simply walked out to meet him, took one corner of the white cloth, and helped him carry their daughter home. They buried Dewi under the banyan tree at the plantation's edge. Darman planted bamboo around her grave, not to make weapons, just bamboo, growing naturally, green and alive, marking where their daughter rested. Now let me tell you the part of the story that textbooks usually skip. The Battle of Surabaya became a turning point, not because of military victory. The Indonesians lost the city, but because of what it revealed. It showed the world that Indonesians would fight with whatever they had, that colonialism couldn't be restored without a bloodbath, that the age of empires was ending. The British, shaken by the ferocity of the resistance, became less enthusiastic about helping the Dutch reclaim their colony. International support for Indonesian independence grew. The bamboo spear became a symbol recognized worldwide, the ultimate asymmetric weapon, the tool of the powerless, making themselves powerful through will alone. But here's what really matters. Darman lived another 30 years. He never picked up a weapon again. He continued tapping rubber trees on the plantation that eventually became collectively owned by its workers. He was quiet, methodical, unremarkable. His neighbors who hadn't gone to Surabaya never knew he'd killed 3 soldiers. They never knew his daughter had died saving his life. In 1968, a young journalist came to the plantation researching the Battle of Surabaya. Someone had mentioned Darman's name. The journalist found him sitting on his front step, the same step where he'd sat the day Sukarno declared independence, staring at his hands. "Pak Darman," the journalist said respectfully, "I'm writing about the battle, about the bamboo spear fighters. Can you tell me what it was like?" Darman was silent for a long time. "You want to know what it was like? I'll tell you. It was terrifying. It was brutal. It was nothing like the stories make it sound. War doesn't feel heroic when you're in it. It feels like madness and screaming and the smell of blood and burning." "Then why did you fight?" "Because someone had to show them we were serious. Someone had to make the cost high enough that they'd think twice. Not just the British, everyone. Every nation that thought they could own another nation. We needed to prove we'd rather die." "And did it work?" Darman finally looked at the journalist. His eyes were tired, ancient beyond his years. "My daughter is dead. Thousands of people are dead. So you tell me, did it work? We're independent now. That's what we wanted. But the cost," he trailed off, looking back at his hands, "the cost is something you carry forever. Do you regret it?" This question made Darman pause. He thought about Dewi, about her smile in those final moments, about Sumira, who'd never been quite the same, about the British soldiers whose faces still visited him in nightmares, about the plantation workers who'd never come home. "No," he said finally, "not the fighting. I regret that it was necessary. I regret every death, every wound, every trauma, but I don't regret standing up, because the alternative was teaching my daughter to kneel, and that, young man, would have been the real tragedy." The journalist published the interview in a small magazine. Almost no one read it. Darman died in 1975, in his sleep, probably dreaming of rubber trees. At his funeral, some of the old plantation workers who'd survived Surabaya came to pay respects. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They'd shared something that words couldn't quite reach. One of them, an old man named Hadi, the one who'd remembered his grandfather's stories about bamboo spears, brought a piece of bamboo and laid it on the grave next to Dewi's. "We held the intersection, brother," he whispered. "We held it as long as we could." So here's what I want you to understand. The bamboo spear isn't just a weapon. It's a statement. It says that dignity matters more than survival. It says that some things are worth dying for. It says that empires fall not because they're defeated on the battlefield, but because they discover that some people simply refuse to be ruled, regardless of the cost. Every November 10th, Indonesia commemorates Heroes' Day, marking the Battle of Surabaya. School children learn about the bamboo spear fighters. Statues depict warriors charging with their simple weapons. Politicians give speeches about courage and sacrifice and national identity. But they rarely tell you about men like Darman, who went back to tapping rubber trees. They rarely tell you about daughters like Dewi who died before they understood what they died for. They rarely tell you about the nightmares, the trauma, the marriages destroyed by what people saw and did, the survivors who drank themselves to death trying to forget. War, even just war, even necessary war, breaks people. The bamboo spear is a symbol of courage, yes, but it's also a symbol of desperation, of what people are pushed to when all other options are exhausted. Darman understood this. That's why he never glorified what happened. He simply said, it was necessary, it was terrible, and both things are true. There's a final piece to this story, one I learned from Darman's grandson, a history professor in Jakarta. After Darman died, they found a box under his bed. Inside was a single bamboo spear, the one he'd carried at Surabaya, the one stained with blood he'd never been able to fully clean, and wrapped around it was a note in his handwriting. This is not a trophy. This is a reminder. We fought because we had to. We won because we refused to lose. But never forget, the real victory isn't independence. The real victory is building a nation where our children never have to pick up weapons like this, where they can grow bamboo for beauty, for construction, for art, for anything except war. If you're reading this and that hasn't happened yet, then our work isn't finished. The spear must be set down. That's the only way this story ends well. The grandson donated the spear to the National Museum. It's there now, in a case labeled Bamboo Runcing, symbol of people's resistance. Thousands of tourists photograph it every year. School groups crowd around while teachers explain its historical significance. Most people who see it think, look at how brave they were. Look at how they fought with so little. But if you look closely, if you really see it, you realize you're looking at something else. Evidence of what humans become when you take everything from them except their dignity. Evidence that sometimes the most primitive weapons carry the most sophisticated message. The bamboo spear says, we are here, we matter. You may have guns and ships and empires, but we have something you can't take, the absolute refusal to cooperate with our own subjugation. That's why it terrified the British more than any rifle. That's why it became a symbol recognized worldwide. Not because it was effective, though it was more effective than anyone expected, but because it represented a kind of commitment that makes empires impossible to sustain. You cannot rule people who would rather die than be ruled, not forever, not without destroying them completely, which is the whole purpose of colonialism. The British learned this in Surabaya. The Dutch learned it over the next 4 years of brutal fighting. Every colonial power eventually learned it, which is why colonialism collapsed so rapidly after World War II. Not because of economic changes or geopolitical shifts, though those mattered, but because people everywhere picked up their own version of the bamboo spear, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, and said, no more. Darman never considered himself special. He was just a man who was tired of kneeling. But multiply him by thousands, by millions, and you get something that no army can defeat, a people who've decided they're willing to pay the cost of freedom. The bamboo that grows around Dewi's grave is 40 feet tall now. Every year it drops seeds that scatter across the old plantation. New bamboo grows, creates its own colonies, spreads further. It's just a plant, doing what plants do. But sometimes when the wind moves through the grove, the bamboo knocks together with a sound like wooden spears clicking in formation. The old plantation workers, the few still alive, say you can hear it on November 10th especially. They say it sounds like memory, like a reminder, like the earth itself remembering what happened here, what was sacrificed, what was won. They say it sounds like a promise. This will not be forgotten. And maybe that's the real point of the story. Not the fighting, not even the victory, but the remembering. Making sure that future generations understand that freedom isn't natural, it's not inevitable, it's not guaranteed. It's something that people fought and died for, often with nothing but bamboo spears and absolute conviction. So the next time you see bamboo growing in a garden, used in construction, carved into art, remember this. In 1945, that plant became a weapon that helped bring down an empire, not through superior force, but through superior will. Remember Darman, who went back to ordinary life because that's what the extraordinary was fighting for, the right to be ordinary, to work and love and raise children without permission from foreign rulers. Remember Dewey, 14 years old, who understood in her final moments that some things matter more than surviving. Remember all the people whose names we'll never know, who picked up bamboo spears and walked into history, terrified and determined, fighting not because they thought they'd win, but because not fighting meant accepting the unacceptable. That's the story of the bamboo spear. Not a weapon, a statement. Not a tool of violence, a tool of refusal. Not the beginning of something new, the end of something very old. The idea that some humans could own other humans, could govern them without consent, could extract their labor and resources without consequence. The bamboo spear said, "That age is over." And 30 years of blood and struggle proved it right.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.